Hello, my name is Ratna Omidvar. In 2016, I was appointed to the Senate of Canada as an independent senator representing Ontario. Before I came to Canada, I lived in Iran for 6 years. I'm not a born Iranian. I moved there in 1975 with my husband and acquired Iranian citizenship through that. In 1981, like many others, I had to flee Iran with my family because I did not want my daughter to live under the repression of the Iranian regime. And I still remember how difficult making that decision to flee was in the middle of the night. It was fraught with peril and fear. And I reflect on that time quite often. And I know that even as I left Iran, I left a huge part of my heart back there. When I was appointed as a senator, the Prime Minister of Canada made note that I was a senator. I was an Iranian-Canadian senator, and I take that responsibility with a great seriousness. And I'm very pleased to be here today on the invitation of the Yara Leadership Society to talk to you briefly about Iran. But first about Yara. Yara is a not-for-profit organization established in 2018. Its mandate is to raise the profile of Iranian Canadians and to celebrate and promote success stories of women leaders from this community in order to inspire our next generation of leaders. Considering current events in Iran, Yara has launched an educational campaign to help raise awareness for Canadians who want to understand Iran a little bit better. As you may know, following the death of the 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian woman, Mahsa Amini, in September 2022, the women in Iran took to the streets, protesting and fighting for their basic human rights. Over the last 4 months, these protests have evolved into a revolution by the Iranian people who are calling for an end to the theocratic regime of 43 plus years. As part of this campaign, Yara is bringing to you a very timely and insightful conversation about the situation in Iran, which is both terrifying and inspiring. Leading this conversation is Sophie Grégoire Trudeau, the Prime Minister's spouse. Ms. Trudeau is a known advocate for gender equality, mental health, and emotional literacy. She will be in conversation with Nima Naghibi, who is a professor at English at the Toronto Metropolitan University and the author of Women, Right, Iran, Nostalgia, and Human Rights from the Diaspora. To give you a better sense of things and provide some context, I'm going to share some historical background about Iran to help you understand and this conversation, and to help you appreciate this beautiful country with its rich and ancient culture and its generous and hospitable people. Iran is situated in the Asian continent. It is bordered by Iraq and Turkey to the west, and by the Caspian Sea to the north, by Afghanistan and Pakistan to the east, and by the Gulf of Oman and the Persian Gulf to the south. Many people mispronounce Iran and call it Iran. The right way of pronouncing it is Iran. It has a population of 86 million, making it the 17th most populous country in the world. Its territory comprises 1.648 million square kilometers, 3 times the size of France. Its capital, Tehran, has a population of nearly 9 million in the seat city, making it the most populous city in Western Asia. The dominant language in Iran is Persian or Farsi, with roughly 62% of Iran's population speaking it. Turkic languages and dialects are spoken by as much as 18% of the population, and there is a significant population of Kurds in the West who speak Kurdish, with more than 5.5 million total speakers in the country. It is also a country of ethnic, religious, and linguistic diversity. Of all Iranian Muslims, 90 to 95% are of the Shiite branch, and the Kurds and Turkmens are predominantly Sunni Muslims, about 5 to 10%. The Christian, Jewish, and Zoroastrian populations are the most significant religious minorities in Iran. Iran is one of the oldest nations in the world, with a history dating back tens of thousands of years. The Cyrus cylinder has been historically recognized as the world's first universal charter of human rights. It was created in 534 BCE on the order of the Persian king Cyrus the Great. It has a long history of scholars that has created a rich culture of art, literature, poetry, cuisine, and music. Famous Iranian poets include Rumi, Hafez, and of course Omar Khayyam. Ancient Iranian thinkers wrote influential texts on philosophy and medicine. Although Iran was never formally colonized since the 19th century, it was subjected to indirect political and economic rule by foreign powers such as Russia and Britain. In 1921, a Persian army officer named Reza Khan staged a coup with the support of the British government to overthrow the Qajar dynasty. In 1926, the British helped organize his coronation and established him as a ruling monarch. In 1935, Reza Shah, which means king, changed the name of the country from Persia to Iran. In 1941, the British, concerned about Reza Shah's pro-Nazi sympathies, arranged to send him into exile and has established his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, in his place. He was the last Shah of Iran and reigned from 1941 until he was overthrown in the Iranian Revolution in 1979. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, there was growing frustration with what many Iranians perceived to be corruption in the Pahlavi monarchy, as well as British and American interference in Iranian domestic affairs. In 1979, Iranians from across the social and political classes came together to overthrow the Shah, forcing him and his family to flee Iran, ending his 38-year reign. Although this was a popular revolution comprised of many different factions, Iranians came together around Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, who initially claimed he would remain a symbolic figurehead. However, once the Pahlavi dynasty was successfully overthrown, Khomeini reneged on his promise and called himself the supreme leader of the newly established Islamic theocratic state. In 1980, within a year of Khomeini taking power, the Iran-Iraq War started. It lasted until 1988. Tensions with the United States and many other nations started during this time and continue to this day. Since the establishment of the Islamic Republic, Iran's government has been controlled by a religious figure called the Supreme Leader, who is appointed by a group of Islamic clerics called the Assembly of Experts. After Khomeini died in 1989, Ali Khamenei replaced him as the Supreme Leader, a role he has been in for over 3 decades. While there are elections held in Iran, they fall short of democratic standards. The president is second in command to the Supreme Leader. Iran's current president is Ibrahim Raisi, a conservative hardliner. Religious tolerance, one of the characteristics of Iran during the Shah's regime, came to an end with the Islamic Revolution. While Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians face discrimination, it is the people of the Baha'i faith, a religion founded in Iran in the 19th century, who are among the most severely persecuted religious minorities. Many Iranians were exiled following the revolution. The Iranian diaspora is estimated at 4 million, with approximately 400,000 in Canada. The majority of Iranian Canadians live in the Greater Toronto area and the Greater Vancouver area. The Iranian-Canadian community today includes members of parliament and legislature, prominent academics and authors, leaders, actors, journalists, among others, all contributing to the Canadian fabric. Throughout the 20th century, different Iranian governments have used women's bodies as a bellwether for Iranian society and the Iranian state. In 1936, Reza Shah, who wanted to create a modern and westernized Iranian society, imposed the mandatory Unveiling Act. The unveiling of women was enforced through violence, as his soldiers tore the veil off the head of any veiled women in public. In 1983, Ayatollah Khomeini, who claimed that the pre-revolutionary regime pandered to Western influences, legislated a mandatory veiling act, which made it compulsory for all women aged 9 and up to wear hijab in public, even non-Muslims and foreigners visiting the country. In both instances, women's bodies were used as symbols of the state, and in both cases, women have resisted these laws. In 1936, devout Iranian women resisted by refusing to leave their homes. In 1979, Iranian women took to the streets on March the 8th, International Women's Day, to protest the soon-to-be legislated mandatory hijab law. While Iranian women have been actively fighting for their rights throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, they have always been forced to make women's rights secondary to what were seen as other, more pressing national demands. This time, though, women's rights are at the heart of their demands. Since September 22, women and girls have taken to the streets in Iran to fight for their basic rights. Standing to shoulder with them are the men across the country. Despite 60% of the population being under the age of 30 and never having enjoyed these basic rights, they are risking their lives, demanding freedom of choice, chanting woman, life, freedom. Time magazine named the women of Iran the heroes of the year in 2022. We are here today to talk about their heroic movement and this women-led revolution. Thank you for listening with interest to this dialogue. I now turn it over to Madame Sophie Grégoire Trudeau and Professor Naghibi. Thank you.
Hi, Nima. How are you today?
I'm fine, thank you. How are you?
Very well. We are in a, place of security and warmth, and that's not the case for so many people around the planet. So we're very lucky. I just want to say and stress that I'm very blessed to be able to have this conversation. I think that when it comes to global conflict and to what's been happening to women in Iran and the solidarity that that a lot of people around the globe have been showing is extremely important. But more importantly, is to understand the conflict itself, so we can form a wise opinion, a well informed opinion, and to know how we can help as well. Because sometimes it's away from us geographically, but it's important to understand where this conflict comes from. You're here today to explain this to us, and I can't wait to hear you. So here we go. So the death of one woman in Iran, turns into this nationwide revolution. How does that happen?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking it. Mahsa Amini's death, as you point out, sparked national and then global outrage for a number of reasons. First of all, she was a young woman, only 22 years of age, who was killed in the prime of her life. The government initially claimed that this otherwise healthy young woman had an undisclosed heart condition and that she just collapsed in a government re-education center. But in reality, she was beaten severely, so much so that she ended up in a coma and died in the hospital. This horrific incident, the arrest, beating, and eventual death of this young woman, served as a catalyst for feminist protests in Iran and then around the world. And I really think that her death triggered a pent-up rage against the oppression of the Iranian government in relation to Iranian women over the past 40 years. So it's important to remember as well that Mahsa Amini is a member of the Kurdish ethnic minority in Iran who have been discriminated against under the Islamic Republic. And her death mobilized anti-government protests in her hometown of Saqqez in Kurdistan. Amini represents a cross-section of the most vulnerable in Iranian society because of her age, because of her gender, because of her ethnicity and her class background. She came from a modest class background. And it was her vulnerable status that triggered the empathy, compassion, and fury of Iranian people, particularly and first and foremost Iranian women, on behalf of this young woman who was killed so ruthlessly by the regime. So in response to her death and the protests in her hometown, young Iranians just filled the streets across the country, showing solidarity with the initial protests in Kurdistan. And this generation of young people, Generation Z, everyone is really remarking on how this is a movement led by this generation of young people. And what they're doing is they're tying women's rights to minority rights, which is a really powerful thing to do. It's a really powerful statement that they're making. And they are incredibly brave and admirable young women who are leading these protests for freedom in Iran.
Now, the big question I know that a lot of people have been asking themselves is, are these protests in Iran, an actual attack on Islam?
Yes, I know that a lot of people might have this question, and it's an important one to clarify because the target here is not religion. It's not Islam in particular, and it's not religion in general. The protesters are expressing their frustration with the restrictive and oppressive government laws imposed in the name of Islam. So from the beginning, these protests emerged out of grief for the death of one woman, Mahsa Amini. And it's also an expression of a collective grief for the generations of women whose lives have been cut short by at the hands of the Islamic Republic. So at its heart, it's a movement for freedom, and it's a movement that rejects hate and discrimination and oppression. It's a movement propelled by the desire to embrace life and choice and freedom. It is an expression of resistance against the ways in which laws are being imposed in the name of religion, but it's not a statement or a movement against religion or Islam.
So when we see women burning their headscarves and cutting their hair, that's the message. It's the message against a system that is oppressing them in their daily lives.
That's right. It's the hijab becomes a symbol here, not of religion, but of an imposed law. So at the start of the protests, we saw that young women were dancing in the streets without their headscarves. They were creating bonfires with their hijab. And so some people in the West thought that these are anti-hijab or anti-veiling. This is an anti-veiling movement, which it absolutely is not, because we're also seeing scenes coming out of Iran of women in headscarves, women who are devout and who have chosen to wear the veil, who are actively protesting alongside unveiled women. What they are asking for, all of them, is the freedom to choose whether they will wear the hijab or not wear the hijab. So it's about freedom of choice. It's about women's bodily autonomy. It's about the ability to make that decision for themselves.
And as I was walking in a protest here in Ottawa with a very tiny and the cutest little girl, Iranian-Canadian, and we were together singing and screaming the "Woman, Life, Freedom" slogan. It was very touching to see that such a young girl was standing up for her sisters in a way, and her aunts and her friends. What does this slogan stand for? What does it really mean? Where is it from?
The slogan "Woman, Life, Freedom" comes from the Kurdish slogan "Jin Jian Azadi." And it emerged initially out of the Kurdish resistance movement in Turkey. And it really highlights the central role of Kurdish women in Kurdish political activism. So Kurdish scholars and activists have argued that the key to a democratic society is having women at its heart. And the slogan for them captures three key areas of concern for Kurdish activists. One is gender oppression. The second is socioeconomic inequities. And the third is the oppression of minority groups under the Islamic Republic. So this slogan, Jinjian Azadi, was first expressed at Mahsa Amini's funeral by her mourners. And it was then heard and taken up by Iranian feminists in other parts of Iran, and they translated it to the Persian Zan Zendegi Azadi. And then it reverberated, it resonated in the diaspora in the West, and Iranian feminists in the diaspora, as well as other feminists, Western feminists, took up this beautiful slogan of woman, life, freedom. And it's really a conjoining of forces and political concerns in a hopeful moment, I think, of transnational feminist solidarity and activism.
As a gender equality activist, I've met young people and young women from across the globe, and young boys as well, who understand that when more than half of the world's population isn't respected because there are women and because there are girls, we're facing major problems on so many different levels. So some people think that feminism is not necessary anymore. We're obviously seeing, and the facts and the research is showing us that that's absolutely untrue. Now, what do you want to tell men and boys about this, and how we can include them in this movement? Because their support is so, so important.
Yes. Well, I think what's wonderful is that we're seeing, in the case of Iran right now, that young men, teenagers, children, boys are joining this movement. They're engaging in feminist activism under this inclusive slogan of woman, life, freedom. And it's fantastic to see that not only are they arguing for structural change, at the level of the state, they're asking for women's legal status to change. But what is really inspiring for me to see is that in the domestic sphere of the home, these traditional gender roles are also being challenged in Iran. So traditionally, I think it's a conjoined effort. I think it's a conjoined effort because even though Iranian women have been active in the feminist movement in Iran for over a century, in the home, there's still been an expectation of certain traditional gender roles. And but I see that being challenged now in the domestic sphere. And I think that that's fantastic.
Absolutely. Do you think these gender roles are related to cultural religious beliefs, or where do they come from?
I think, yes, it's cultural. I think these are cultural, deep-seated, cultural beliefs. So certain kind of, these are roles that perhaps we have just fallen into a certain expectation that, women, and this is actually not exclusive to Iran. This has been something that I think that women globally have had to resist. The idea that, women are the keepers of the hearth, they're the ones who stay home and take care of the children and do the cooking, and that's where their expertise is best used, and that the men are the ones who go out and make the laws. And I think that we see that everywhere now, this idea is being challenged. And certainly we can see that in Iran as well.
And you've been using the word resistance, which to me is so triggering, because when human beings, and i.e. women here in so many places around the world, are in resistance mode, we're not in creative mode. And the only way we can fully contribute to our own selves and to our societies, our communities, and life itself is to be our own unique creative self. So this is a profound situation that needs to change from the core. A lot of people see the protests through television. Obviously, not everybody's in Iran, and we get what we get from the news. But where are all these protests taking place mainly?
Well, what's incredible about this movement is that it is taking place across the country. There have been many instances of resistances, protests, demonstrations against the Islamic regime over the past 40 years. Most recently, people might remember the 2009 demonstrations, which were also called the Green Movement. Those protests, though, were mostly taking place in urban centers and were dismissed by the government by saying that, well, these protesters are representing only the concerns of the middle classes. In 2017 and 2019, there were protests in more rural, regional areas, and they were led mostly by the working classes. What's interesting and different about these protests is that they are including a cross-section of Iranian society. So we have the middle classes and the working classes out on the streets. The protests are taking place in city centers, in large urban centers, as well as in rural regions. So it is definitely a national movement.
It's definitely putting pressure on the government. How is the government reacting to all this?
Unfortunately, the government has been ruthless and relentless and shameless in the way that it is inflicting violence on its own citizens. So it has shown that it has no compunction. The government has no compunction about arresting and killing and executing even the youngest of its citizens. So to date, it's very hard to get exact numbers right now coming out of Iran, but I can give some rough numbers that I'm hearing, that approximately 500 demonstrators have been shot and killed on the streets. About 14,000, I'm hearing that number. I'm also hearing 18,000 people have been arrested. There are about 24 people currently who have been sentenced to death, who are arrested and are awaiting execution. At least 4 or 5 people just recently in the past week have been executed. So the government is reacting by cracking down hard, and they show no signs of letting up. And it is absolutely terrifying and heartbreaking to be a witness to this, especially from afar.
Well, I can only speak for myself, but I completely agree with what you've said, and I know thousands of Canadians who have shown up to show solidarity to Iranian women. What can we do? What can we do to make it change?
It's such a good question, and it's such a tough question. But I think the best thing that Canadians can do is to keep themselves informed about what is going on in Iran. And to try and keep the names of these brave young people in the news, keep this issue live, repost what you see on social media, and show up to some of the demonstrations. That there have been many demonstrations organized by members of the Iranian diaspora in Canada. So it would be wonderful to see people who are not members of the Iranian community showing their solidarity by coming to these demonstrations and just talking about it, just making sure that everybody knows about what is going on in Iran, so that the international community is aware and they can hold the country accountable for what's going on and for their reaction to these brave and innocent young people who are just asking for the basic rights that we take for granted every day.
Yes, that's very well said. We tend to do that. Women, life, freedom. I hope that this conversation, as little as it is, but how greatly we hold it in our hearts and in our minds can at least inform some people on how to get better involved and how to perceive the reality and the truth of the conflict, because the hardest thing in one's life is to face our own truths as individuals and as a society. So thank you for shedding light on this. Thank you for allowing people to have a better understanding of the situation. And I wish you all the best.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for taking the time to conduct this interview. It's so important to have your voice here as well. Thank you.
Thank you for taking the time to watch this video, which we hope you found helpful and informative. The purpose of this video was to create conversation and raise awareness about the situation in Iran and the fight for basic human rights led by the women of Iran. We hope that you will continue this conversation and help keep the plight of the people of Iran top of mind. Yara Leadership Society is a nonprofit organization, leadership-focused and entirely volunteer-run. Please take a minute to visit our website to learn more about the work that we do, and if you're able, please make a donation so that we can continue with our future endeavors. In the meanwhile, here's hoping to a free Iran. Woman, life, freedom. Thank you for joining us.
چهره‌ای که میخنده برای دانش آموزا، برای آینده، برای این بهشت اجباری، برای نخبه های زندانی، برای کودکان افغانی، برای این همه، برای غیر تکراری، برای این همه شعارهای تو خالی، برای آوار خونه های پوشالی، برای احساس آرامش، برای خورشید پس از شبای طولانی، برای قرصای حساب و بیخوابی، برای مرد میهن آبادی، برای دختری که آرزو داشت پسر بود، برای زن زندگی آزادی، برای آزادی.